Alright, so hello one and all, welcome back to another Mushoku Tensei episode review where I'll be going over the anime, manga, and light novel to talk about everything that the anime covered and everything that it skipped, and this is going to be, I think it's the longest episode review thus far. So, I'm just gonna jump right into it with the manga. So Rudeus wakes up to Ruijerd in his face and freaks out for obvious reasons. The two of them talk about what just happened, about Orsted and the seven great powers, and we might have seen them before at some point, but we get a nice look at their symbols, which is pretty cool, I think. And we never actually get to see the talk between Rudeus and Hitogami, but he does relay all the information that he received from Hitogami to Ruijerd. Ruijerd, knowing that Rudeus was hiding something, made him spill the beans. And although Ruijerd is a bit skeptical, he believes Rudeus because he trusts him. And Rudeus lets them know about the curse put on the Superds because of Laplace's spears. And curses aren't normally able to be moved or transferred according to Ruijerd, but Rudeus says that this curse is different. It can be removed. And it has been ever since Ruijerd cut his hair. And then the following day, Ruijerd is driving a carriage as Eris and Rudeus are in the back. Eris, super close to Rudeus and leaning up against him, which she never really does, all while he is trying to practice the disturb magic just in case if they ever run into Orsted again. And when hearing his name, she has a disturbed look on her face and inches away from Rudeus. All depressed, Eris asks why Rudeus is so strong, but he says that she's far stronger than him, and it's not like Eris is the only one who got beat by Orsted. All three of them did. She tries to retort, but Rudeus says, "Look, you're still young, Eris. As long as you keep at it, you'll get stronger. Please don't worry, Eris. If you're ever in a dangerous situation, then I'll do everything I can to carry you to safety." And with a pause, she finally says okay as Ruijerd looks back at the two of them. And eventually they make it so close that they can finally see the refugee camp, and that is where Ruijerd takes his leave. He says that the three of them are all soldiers and that there's no need to stick around like a babysitter. But Eris yells and says that that isn't true. She says that she's still a kid, and Ruijerd goes, "Alright, let me treat you like a kid one last time then." And she says, "Okay, since I am a kid after all." And Ruijerd pats her on the head and says that she has enough talent to surpass even him one day. But she doesn't really agree. He reminds her that she fought against someone who is called a god and she lived. She is a true warrior. Stand tall and hold your head up and face the world with pride. She raises her head with tears in her eyes and says that she finally understands. And Rudeus knew that they'd part ways at this moment, but part of him always thought that Ruijerd would kind of just stick with them and live with them like a family. Surely if he asked Ruijerd, he'd stay, but that wouldn't really be fair to him. Ruijerd acknowledged them as warriors. They can't rely on him forever. Rudeus thanks Ruijerd for his help on bringing them home, but Ruijerd says that even without his help, he was sure that they would have made their way back regardless. "Rudeus, you're already an accomplished magician. You've got so much talent, but you've still managed to stay humble, and keep striving for greater heights. Be proud, be confident, and keep moving forward. A young man like you has the whole world before him." And Rudeus says that he too understands, and he bows his head, but is caught by Ruijerd's hand. He tells him not to bow down to him because he sees Rudeus as an equal. And Rudeus doesn't think that he's really helped Ruijerd at all, but he says that in the past 400 years he hasn't been able to take a single step forward, but Rudeus helped him take that step. It's all because of him. Sure, some god might have told him some things, but at the end of the day, who cares about some god you've never seen? It was Rudeus that helped him. And he says, "If you want to thank me, look at me in the eye." The two of them shake hands as Rudeus recalls the past 3 years that they've been together. And then Eris asks what Ruijerd is going to do next, and he said that he'll be searching the central continent for any super that he can find. Ruijerd tries to give back the meager pendant, but Rudeus tells him to keep it. And Ruijerd then says, "Well, Rudeus and Eris, until we meet again." And Dead End splits up and they part ways. And so now Eris and Rudeus enter the refugee camp and go to the temporary guild hall and speaks with the receptionist. Upon hearing Eris's name, she runs into the back, and in an instant, Ghislaine comes running out and says, "Eris, Lady Eris, it's good to see you." But Eris tells her just to drop the lady, it's just Eris. And they all head into the back room, Rudeus included, because of Eris' demands, and Eris asks about the deceased. And Alphonse talks about the plan for Eris to marry Pylemon, and Ghislaine gets angry, and Eris tells everybody to leave as she cries in the room alone. Pretty standard stuff. After hearing about what happened with Rudeus and Eris for the past 3 years, Alphonse acknowledges Rudeus as a retainer of the Boreas family and thanks him for bringing her home safe. He then wishes to discuss Eris' future. Since James is listed as the reigning lord of the region, it would make sense for Eris to be fit into his family. but it's unlikely that he'd ever take her in, plus she might not even be treated as royalty. On the other hand, they're sending her off to Paimon. That's not really a great option either because he's been working close with Lord Darius. Lord Darius being like the guy who tried to kidnap Eris before and wants to do some horrible things to her. But Paimon once worked closely with Ariel until she was banished from the kingdom and was supposedly killed. And so now, seeking power, she went over to Lord Darius, who works for Prince Grable. Alphonse wants to know Rudeus' opinion on this, but Rudeus asks Ghislaine what she thinks. God, all these S's. Alphonse wants to know Rudeus' opinion, but Rudeus asks Ghislaine what she thinks, and she says that Eris should be with Rudeus. Rudeus, on the other hand, thinks that it should be up to Eris to decide for herself where she goes, and he heads off to bed, ending the conversation there. And then Eris arrives in her room and says that it's her birthday, which isn't true. It was a few days ago, but who cares? Continuity doesn't matter. And she wants Rudeus to become her family in any way, shape, or form. It doesn't matter. And he notices that she's wearing perfume and she says that she wants to sleep with him. Rudeus thinks about it, like Eris just lost her home and her family. She is in total shock right now. She wants someone, in this case Rudeus, to stay with her and pretend that they're family. Rudeus goes like, are you sure? Like, is that what you want? I might end up doing something to you if we sleep together, but she says that that's completely fine. Rudeus asks if he understands what she's saying, and she's like, I have a pretty good idea, don't worry. And Rudeus thinks that she's trying to punish herself for something and thinks back to the visual novels that he used to play. Whenever a character lost someone close to them, they'd seek physical comfort. He feels as though he'd be taking advantage of Eris if he went through with it. Eris says that they made a promise when she turned 15 that they'd sleep together, but Rudeus corrects her and says, no, it's when I turn 15, not you. But again, Eris just doesn't care. And she's like, so what, you don't want to sleep with me? But Rudeus says like, oh, dude, of course I want to sleep with you. Oh my god, it's you, right? And he obviously doesn't want Eris to turn into some nobleman's plaything, but they made a promise. They can't do anything big like this when they're both in the wrong mind space. And they should wait until they both truly know that they're in love with each other. And he cuts himself off and thinks about what he just said. Does he love Eris? And Eris is like, so you do want me, but you still don't want to, right? But then Rudeus brings her in for a hug as they fall into the bed, and Eris says, I want to be your little kitten, Rudeus. All night long. Meow. Not gonna lie, that was kind of fun. And she looks at Rudeus, all embarrassed, you and me the same, girl, as the two of them laugh about it. And then, to quote, that night, I loved Eris, and I still love Eris. I know it's been hard on her since the magical calamity, but she has always been by my side. She's always thought about me. Who cares about everything else? I'll just keep Eris safe, always. I will be her family. I'm thinking 3 kids wouldn't be bad, but actually I'd be okay with even more. As long as I'm with Eris, I'm sure the future will be a happy one. And as Rudeus sleeps, Eris touches his face and cries. Then the next morning, Rudeus brags about how he's not a virgin anymore, and now he's like all the normies that he once made fun of. And then he notices that Eris is gone. Her hair is on the ground, and on top of it, it is a note that reads, Rudeus, you and I are not equals. I am leaving on a journey. Eris. Rudeus freaks out and runs to Alphonse, who tells him that Ghislaine and Eris went on her journey and won't tell Rudeus where they went. Rudeus asks himself why Eris dumped them and abandoned him, and we close off the chapter like that. So that was a pretty similar to the anime, not gonna lie. Just a very condensed version of what the anime covered, I guess. And I'm not gonna lie, don't know if I needed to cover all of that in that much detail, but I'm going to anyway. So let's move on to the light novel, where things are actually pretty different here, and there's a lot expanded upon. So, I'll catch you on the flip side. So it's been 3 days since the incident with Orsted, and Dead End has finally arrived in the Asura Kingdom. And Rudeus thinks back to the incident, and in the moment, of course, he didn't want to die, but for some reason, he wasn't really traumatized in the slightest. In fact, he kind of felt refreshed. It felt like he was waking up and going like, oh, is that just a dream? Maybe it's because he saw Hitogami right as he was dying or something. The experience kind of just felt so surreal. It didn't feel like it actually happened. And so to put it like that, it almost seemed as though Hitogami guessed what was happening and forced himself into Rudeus' consciousness. On an instinctive level, Rudeus wanted to push Hitogami away, but he did care about Ruijerd and his affairs, so maybe Hitogami's not that bad after all. And ever since that day, Eris had been sticking like really close to Rudeus whenever they were inside the carriage. Before, she'd stand diagonally across from them and claim that she was doing balance training and asks Rudeus to join her, but now she sits close to him as like so close that the thighs are touching. And the day before, I guess Rudeus saw some skin peeking out of the hem of her pants. Ooh, those ankles. Shit, those are hot. And he claimed that it was only human instinct to want to touch something that you can see, and so he reached out with his right hand and stroked it. And normally where there'd be a punch, Eris only glared at him with her face bright red. And actually she hasn't really been punching him at all lately, even for things that he clearly deserved. Her face would kind of just flush and she'd glower at him instead. Glower? I don't know. And to be honest, with her being so close, it's getting a little bit much for Rudeus. He was ready to just throw his hands down her pants just to get her away. It was hard to hold himself back. And whether Eris knew of Rudeus' internal conflict or not, she stayed close to him at all times. And if Rudeus left his hands unoccupied, they'd wander over in Eris' direction. So he decided to practice the disturb magic that Orsted used, but it's proving to be much more difficult done than said. The magic itself was quite similar to the king tier barrier that he was trapped in back in the Throne Kingdom, but he couldn't quite master it. With his non-dominant left hand, he created a small rock, but with his right, he did attempt to nullify it. He could still create magic, albeit imperfectly, and so it was extremely to perform it just as Orsted had done before. And that means that there were rules involved in disturbing magic. Possibly what this means is that if he can unleash magic in accordance to those rules, he could possibly nullify Orsted's disturb magic. The possibilities for this were certainly growing. Eris and Rudeus talk as she asks what he's doing, and he explains that he's doing the disturb magic, but she says that he's so strong and that she isn't. Rudeus asks if she's worried about the fact that she got defeated so easily, and she says that she is. And Rudeus thought about the opponent, Orsted, from the other day. He was quite literally the best of the best. Like, even back in Rudeus' old life, when he played a game that he was super confident in, he always knew that there was going to be someone better than him. And the same goes with strength and power in this world. Orsted completely dominated Ruijerd, took out Eris in one hand, and rendered Rudeus completely powerless. On top of all that, he fought and moved in such a precise way that he exerted no more effort than necessary to defeat you, meaning he still had more energy left to spare. There was literally no telling how strong Orsted was if he went all out. Rudeus tells her that Orsted was just an unfair opponent to have and that she wasn't at fault for her loss. Eris is young, and so long as she works hard, she'll get stronger. And Eris is like, you really think so? And Rudeus is like, yeah, even Ghislaine and Ruijerd said the same thing, didn't they? And then Eris lifted her head and looked Rudeus in the eye. She said, you know you almost died, right? How can you say that so easily? And he says, because I don't want to die next time. He tells her not to worry and that he'll work hard so that if they ever end up in a dangerous situation, he can pick her up and make a run for it. Eris had a complicated look on her face as she rested her head against his shoulder. If he weren't practicing the disturb magic, he'd probably reach over and stroke her head. No matter what happens, we've got to get a little stronger, Rudeus said. Just a little bit more. There's no way that they'll become the strongest in the world. The ceiling's just way too high, but he wanted to get at least strong enough so that they could get away if they were attacked by some weirdo. Speaking of which, he pressed his face into Eris's hair and inhaled her scent. I think he has to protect her from himself by fighting himself. He's the weirdo here. Once night fell and it was only Ruijerd and Rudeus awake, he spoke to Ruijerd. The two of them hadn't talked much since the incident with Orsted, but it's possible that Ruijerd blamed himself for what happened. The two of them hadn't really spoken much since the incident with Orsted, but it's possible that Ruijerd blamed himself for what happened, because despite his promise to deliver Rudeus and Eris home safely, he wasn't able to protect them then. Rudeus told Ruijerd that they faced off against the dragon god Orsted, number 2 of the 7 great powers, and Ruijerd understands and realizes that's why he was so strong. It was actually the first time since Laplace that he took just one glance at someone and knew that he couldn't defeat him. And he says that even Ruijerd himself couldn't stand against the elite of these 7 great powers. They're just monsters beyond comprehension. It was bad luck that they just ran into one, but at the same time, it was good luck that they survived. The way that Ruijerd said it, it sounded like he was just trying to make excuses, but it also felt as though there was a touch of self-reproach in his tone. He likely knew that there was nothing that he could do, but he still saw it as a separate matter from him being unable to fulfill his duty. And Ruijerd tells Rudeus that next time they run into someone like that, you don't talk to them, you don't pick a fight with them, and you don't even look at them. He's clearly a little angry at Rudeus, but then he asks Rudeus about the man god Hitogami. Rudeus then tells him everything. He tells him about the curse of the Superds, and he explains how the curse was transferred to the Superds from the spears by Laplace, but it's been slowly being lifted for some strange reason. Curses aren't supposed to be able to be transferred. It's never even heard of, but it's Laplace we're talking about, so he can basically do anything according to Ruijerd. And he's never even heard of a curse that affected an entire tribe before. And Ruijerd then starts to cry tears of joy that the curse is being lifted and that his actions weren't in vain, and Rudeus pretends not to notice it as he went off to bed. There Ruijerd was a reliable warrior and a strong man who didn't cry. And so about a month had passed since then. Dead End didn't visit the capital, but just followed a narrow route north. They had passed through many small farming villages and saw wheat fields and water mills as they continued their way. They didn't even gather any information along the way. They'd catch up on everything once they got to the refugee camp anyway, and they were almost there. There was no way they were going to slow down now. But eventually they arrived in the Fedoa region, which, in comparison to the land that they've just traversed, was completely empty. No wheat fields, no fields of vitreous flowers, no water mills, no buildings, nothing but a field of grass. And soon they arrived at the only city in the Fedoa region, the refugee camp, their final destination. And just then, Ruijerd hopped out of the carriage and said that this is where he'll be taking his leave. Rudeus and Eris kind of scrambled out of the carriage and nearly fell as they tried to protest his leave, but he said that they are warriors. They don't need his protection. They have their conversation about how Ruijerd and Rudeus are equals, and he tells Rudeus, as a magician, you've already attained a kind of perfection. Despite all the talent you possess, you still don't let it get to your head. You should be aware of how much it means to be able to do that at your age. And Rudeus was a little conflicted at these words. Since he wasn't really a 13-year-old kid, he was technically 47 in total, but even still, to Ruijerd, I guess 47 is likely to be considered young anyway. And Rudeus tries to bow his head to Ruijerd, but is stopped. They both helped each other out, and they thanked each other. And then Ruijerd turned his attention to Eris, and he raised his hand above her head, asking if he can treat her like a kid one last time. And she goes, fine, whatever, go for it. And then he patted her on the head, telling her that she can grow far stronger than him one day, but she calls him a liar. And he says, you survived an attack in battle from a man who bears the name of a god. And he drops off. He doesn't even need to finish his sentence. You understand what that means, right? That's what he was going to say. And Eris glared at him sharply, but then her eyes widened with realization, and she said that she understands. He says, good girl, before dropping his hand. And from there, Ruijerd will look for the other traces of Superds on the central continent. He now knows, thanks to Rudeus, that he can't fix the Superds' reputation alone. He'll need help. And Rudeus says, good luck. If I have any free time, I'll see what I can do to help out. And Ruijerd says that if he has any free time, he'll help look for Zenith. Ruijerd wants to return the Meagred pendant because it's important to Rudeus, but he tells him to keep it. And then Ruijerd says, let's meet again, as he turns and walks away, eventually becoming a silhouette. And eventually that silhouette becoming nothing. The two watch him disappear from their sight in silence. And this is how their journey reached its conclusion. As Rudeus and Eris entered the refugee camp, which was the size of a city in the Demon Continent, it still felt lifeless. There were certainly people here, but there was no spirit left within the residents. In the middle of the camp stood a wooden building that resembled an adventurer's guild. According to a note written on the entrance, it was the headquarters of the refugee camp. Within the building was a board of the missing and deceased, and labeled was a note saying, seeking status information, deceased or missing, which was ordered by the Fedoa Liege Lord James Boreas Greyrat. That wasn't exactly a good sign. They spoke to the receptionist, who upon hearing Eris' name brought out Alphonse and Ghislaine. Although they were certainly happy to be reunited, Ghislaine knew the coming conversation and looked somber. Alphonse tells Rudeus to wait there, as he, Eris, and Ghislaine discuss things, but Eris tells him that Rudeus will join. And grabbing his hand, they enter a room that basically just had nothing but it just had a sofa and a table in it, and that's basically it. And so without being told what to do, Eris takes a seat on the sofa with Rudeus by her side. Alphonse tries to ease their way into the conversation, but Eris just cuts him off and asks who died, and then Lord Soros, Lord Philip, and Lady Hilda were all deceased. And again, I'm just repeating myself here. But apparently Philip and Hilda, because they were teleported into the conflict zone, it wasn't a pleasant death. I'll just say that. Not that any death is good, but like theirs is apparently like, it was a bad death. It was pretty gruesome. So that's cool. Poor them. Now Rudeus, initially angry, understood why it happened. And now Rudeus, initially angry about Soros's execution, understood why it happened. It was like back in Japan. If something bad or shameful were to happen, the prime minister would take responsibility and resign. By dying, Soros had taken the people's discontent with him. Putting the blame on someone and offing them would bring relief to some people. Is it right what they did? Not really. But let's be honest, the real reason for his execution was likely for more political motives anyway. Although Rudeus can rationalize it, it doesn't really matter. Out of the hundreds of thousands of people who died, Soros lived. He did anyway, until they purposefully killed a man who had returned alive. Eris had come all the way home just to return to this and to learn that. But Rudeus couldn't really think straight. As all this happened, as the conversation continued, Eris's grip on Rudeus's hand tightened more and more with each bit of news. But Eris asks what she could do, and in an uncharacteristically quiet manner, mind you, and Alphonse brings up that she should become the concubine of Lord Paimon Noto's Grey Rat. He and Ghislaine get into the argument before Eris yells, "Enough!" so loud that Ghislaine had to cover her ears. This was the full extent of Eris's bellow, one that hadn't been heard in quite a while. But that seemed to be all of the energy that she had within her. After that, Eris said, "Just leave me by myself. I want to think." And Alphonse left as Ghislaine reluctantly exits after him, but as Rudeus goes to speak, she says, "Rudeus, did you not hear me? Leave me alone now." And she turned her back to him. This was the first time in a few years that Eris had pushed him away like that, especially for like the past month or so where she'd always been clinging to him. But he says that he understands and he walks out of the room with his shoulders drooped. As he closed the door, he swore that he could hear her cry from the other side. There were some rooms that Alphonse had prepared for Rudeus and Eris, and Rudeus took their luggage, put his luggage in one room, and dropped Eris's things into another. And he changed into some non-adventurer clothing, putting his patched up robe on the bed, and he then left the room. Rudeus wanted to look for Alphonse and Ghislaine, but he couldn't find them, and he didn't really have the energy to actually go look for them, so he went back to the headquarters and looked at the bulletin board. He saw the note that Paul had written when Rudeus was, 10 years old, I guess? And he'll now be 13 soon. Time kind of went by pretty quickly now that I think about it, but he looked over the names of the missing and the deceased and saw that Law's and Sylvie's names had been crossed off. According to Paul, Laws had died, and looking at the list of the deceased, he could see Law's name, but not Sylvie's, thankfully. And Rudeus went over to the receptionist to ask what that means, and she said that if a name is crossed off but not on the list of deceased, it means that they've been found, and they are alive. Rudeus asks for the contact information for Sylvie, but after 20 minutes, the clerk came back empty-handed. If the person didn't report to the headquarters and leave contact info, then there simply wasn't any to give. And so that meant one of two things. Either Sylvie had stopped on by only briefly, crossed her name off and left, or someone else had crossed her name off for her. But for now, all he knows is that Sylvie is alive. So let's just hope she's still safe though. But then again, she's capable of doing silent spellcasting and healing, something that not even Rudeus can do. So she's likely to be fine on her own no matter where she is and whatever prejudice that she has against her with her hair. And Rudeus went back to the board to cross the rest of his family's names off, which was only really Lily and Aisha, since at some point someone had crossed off Rudeus's name upon his arrival. But that meant only Zenith was left to be found. The next time Rudeus speaks to Hitsugami, he'll be sure to ask him about her whereabouts. And so after finishing up with the board, he notices that Eris still hasn't come out of the room. She was normally quick to recover, but not this time. To be fair, after journeying for so far and so long just to get to Fedoa, there was no family or warm house to welcome her back. It was likely to overwhelm someone even as strong as Eris. And Rudeus thinks to go into her room and comfort her, but he decides against it. He decides instead to head back to his room where he'll be staying and to get some rest. But right as he's about to, Alphonse calls to him and brings him into a room somewhere else in the headquarters. So now Alphonse, sitting in front of Rudeus and Ghislaine, asks him to provide a report about the past 3 years. Complying, Rudeus describes what happened since the teleportation incident. Well, basically described what happened to Eris since then, mostly, because obviously Alphonse isn't going to care about him or Ruijerd. But Alphonse, impressed by Ruijerd's actions, wants to give him a reward. But Rudeus says that he isn't really the kind of guy to accept something like that. But after the explanation, Alphonse states that all of those who served Lord Soros it was only them three that remained: Ghislaine, Alphonse, and Rudeus, who was just appointed as a vassal. But Rudeus questions what happened to the maids, and all Alphonse could say is that they just never returned. They're either dead or they returned back to their homeland. And he adds, but the Lord took such good care of them too. How dreadful. But in response, Rudeus coldly said that it was ultimately nothing more than a financial relationship to the maids. And as he said that, Alphonse's poker face kind of cracked slightly. And because of Rudeus's youth, Alphonse questioned to bring Rudeus into this conversation, but if he can make retorts like that, he's certainly capable of handling the incoming conversation. The conversation being, of course, about Eris's future. He presented two options. One, let Eris be adopted by Lord James, the current liege lord, and Eris's uncle. However, it's unlikely that he'd even take her in, and on top of that, she'd be treated quite unfairly. This option was just basically ruled out. Or two, let Eris marry Lord Pailmon, the current head of the Notos family, Rudeus's uncle, and for her to become one of his concubines. The problem with that is likely Eris would be passed off to the High Minister Darius, who had been growing in power and took an interest in Eris sexually. But if she endured this, she'd curry favor with him and possibly be able to request to have land built in the Fedoa region and therefore be able to rebuild the Boreas family. Neither were really good options, so Rudeus threw the mic to Ghislaine to ask for her opinion, and she says that Eris should stay with Rudeus. And Rudeus does have a little bit of political power, and although Paul isn't the head of his family, Pailmon is, he's grown a bit of power and had good reputation since the teleportation incident. Not only that, Zenith also comes from a powerful noble family in Milis. With Rudeus's lineage and background, Rudeus is capable of making a place for himself among the Asur nobility. The problem with this is that it's unlikely that James, the liege lord, would let Rudeus oversee the Fedoa region. And it's further unlikely, and it's even more unlikely, that Pailmon would let a son of Paul have any power. On top of all of that, James and Darius would not look too kindly at Eris marrying into the family of another influential person. In that case, Ghislaine suggests for Eris and Rudeus to just run away together, and Alphonse and her start to have that argument. He says that it's their dream to have Eris take control of the land that their dear grandfather loved, but Ghislaine retorts and says that it's his dream for that to happen, not everyone's. And the two continue to argue before Rudeus interrupts him. At the end of the day, it's Eris's decision, so she should be the one to make the call. And so Rudeus says that if there's nothing else to talk about, he's heading off to his room to get some rest. And so just like that, the day's meeting had come to an end. And Rudeus went back to his room, and by the time he did, the sun had already set. Despite not being too close to Sorop, Phila, or Hilda, he was still depressed about their deaths. He remembered going on long rides with Soros, or when Philip saw that awful smile as he proposed to take over the Boreas household together, and how Hilda begged him to marry her daughter. They were all gone now. Not even their house remained. The vast manor and the voices that boomed and echoed inside were gone. The reception hall where Eris and Rudeus had danced, the tower where Soros had had his private moments, the library filled with documentation relating to the region, it was all gone. And it wasn't just the manor either, it was Buena Village. Not that Rudeus went to see for himself, but the tree in their garden that Zenith treasured so much, the trees that Roxy charred with lightning when she was teaching Rudeus Saint-Tier magic, and the large tree that he and Sylphie would play under, they were all gone. And why were the only memories that Rudeus had about Buena Village all about trees? Doesn't matter. They're all gone regardless. And it was one thing to hear about the state of the region, but it was another thing to witness it, like, for yourself. As he thought all of that, Eris knocked on the door as Rudeus let her in as he sat up on the bed. She said that she was fine and she kind of stood in her regular pose. But this is Eris we're talking about. She would never really knock on the door. She would just let herself in. It's clear that she wasn't fine. She says that she figured that this is how things would be. But just as Rudeus was thinking, it's one thing to be told this rather than to actually face the situation for yourself. But even Rudeus' family wasn't entirely out of the rain yet either. Zenith still hadn't been found, and it's unlikely that she's even around anybody else. He understood that, but couldn't bring himself to accept it. Rudeus asks Eris what she'll do next, but she doesn't really care about any of the politics. It's only now that Rudeus realized that Eris wasn't wearing her usual getup. She's wearing the black one-piece dress that she hadn't worn since they bought it back in Militian. It matched so well with her red hair that it almost looked like a dress, and he could see her breasts pushing through the thin material, which means that she's not wearing a bra. And her hair looked damp, and he could smell soap as well too, along with a faint but sweet fragrance. It's perfume. She says, Rudeus, I'm all alone now. And besides that, I recently turned 15. Rudeus apologizes for not remembering, and she said that it was the day that Ruijerd told her that she was a warrior. And so, side note, Rudeus says that his birthday was only like a month or two away, which means that hers was about a month ago. And so if Rudeus had like an April-ish birthday, that would mean that Eris should have like a January-ish birthday. I am one step closer to figuring out the true dates of these characters. But Rudeus panics and asks what she wants, but she simply says that she wants just one thing: a family. For Rudeus to become her family. It doesn't matter how, she just wants to sleep with him. And Rudeus teases her and tests the waters by saying that he'll probably do something perverted to her. And like he said before, it's not going to be just a little bit if he does it. And she says that's completely fine. And after hearing that, his little soldier downstairs was now having his own standing ovation. Rudeus asks why Eris is doing all this, but she says that it's because of their promise when she turned 15, but Rudeus corrects her. It's when he turns 15, but again, she just doesn't care. He understands that she's being self-destructive and just wants physical comfort. Normally, Rudeus would jump the gun and be totally fine with this, but obviously this wasn't really a normal situation. If they ended up doing this, they'd likely regret it. But then again, if he doesn't do this, she might get sent off to be some noble's plaything, and then he'd regret not doing it. On the other hand, who knows if he'd even make it to the promised age? He almost died a month ago after all, and he could die at some point within the next 2 years, and he'd completely miss the opportunity to do it anyway. Regardless, he would end up regretting the decision no matter what happened until he turned 15. And after getting frustrated by Rudeus's indecisiveness, Eris kind of just goes like, geez man, come on. And she softly sits on his lap sideways so she could wrap her arms around his neck, presenting him with a view of her tanned breasts and beautiful face. She opened her mouth to speak before noticing something was pressing against her thigh. And her face, which was already red ear to ear, got even redder. She asks what's going on, and he says, well, it's because you're cute. And she only hummed and returned as she ground her thighs against it. I feel like I'm going into too much detail. But she's like, so this means you're turned on right now, right? Yeah. So you don't dislike me? No. Are you worried about my father and grandfather? Yeah. Rudeus, you've been giving me a naughty look this entire time. Yeah. But you're still going to refuse me? Yeah. I am. And he says a promise is a promise, right? After a pause, Eris huffed and said that she was going to do something that her mother taught her and that she'll only say once. She leaned in and brought her lips to his ear. Then came a few words in a tone so soft and so sweet, as though a forbidden seal had been undone. Rudeus, I want to be your little kitty. Meow. I hope you're happy. Because I want to fucking die. But you know what's happened next. How does it feel that I've basically just been reading erotica to you this episode? But anyway, they do the deed, and during that time, Rudeus forgot about anything else that was weighing him down, and all he could think about was what he wanted to do with Eris. He didn't say it, but Rudeus thinks that he loves Eris. He wanted to protect her forever and didn't care about the circumstances. And hell, Paul said it himself, right? Who cares about the noble's duties? Rudeus didn't need to think about stuff like that. He'd do anything to help Eris. And while they're at it, 3 children would be fine. But Rudeus was sure that he would end up making more than that. He was elated, but it never even crossed his mind to wonder what Eris herself might be thinking. And it's here where we get to something that both the anime and manga skip. Eris's point of view of the situation and the entire journey as a whole. She talks about her mindset from the very beginning. She introduces herself as Eris Boreas Grey Rat, and that day she had become an adult because Rudeus gave her the present that she had always wanted. It was a bit different from what they'd promised, but they tied themselves together all the same. And so let's take a jump into the past. Eris loved Rudeus and had ever since his 10th birthday. She was sleeping when her mother shook her awake, gave her a red nightgown, and told her with a serious face to go to Rudeus's bed and surrender her body to him. Eris wasn't against having sex, but she was confused. Both Hilda and Edna had explained it to her, and so she'd understand what would happen one day, but she wasn't prepared for it and thought that it would happen much further in the future. Regardless if Rudeus knew of Eris's trepidation, he touched her body anyway. He and her father would talk late at night, so it's likely that he was already told of this. And as she considered that, another thought popped into her head. Maybe he doesn't actually love me. Maybe he was only doing this because Philip told him to. She thought about how amazing Rudeus was and that he knew everything and could do anything, but it never hampered his desire to keep learning and continue to move forward. She was sure that Rudeus suited her well, but she also felt that he didn't care about her feelings, that she was just some reward given to him by her father. When she realized that she wasn't okay with it anymore, she shoved him away and ran back towards her room. However, as she did, she got scared. Maybe she did something that she could never take back and she wasted her chance. Eris's mother had told her that Rudeus was the one for her, and comparing the other children of the noble families, they couldn't compare. She was right. And then again, Rudeus had always been interested in her body from the beginning. Each and every time he made a move, she'd hit him. Anytime the other kids at school would make her angry, she'd hit them and they'd back off. But Rudeus never did. Hilda was right, and Eris felt it with every fiber of her being, that Rudeus was the one for her. If he hated her, she thought that she'd spend her entire life alone. And so she thought, who cares if I'm just a reward? At least we can be together. And so she returned to his room, only to see him immediately on the ground apologizing. She told him to wait 5 years because she thought that would be enough. Rudeus was enough of an adult to wait for her, and that's when she started to fall in love with him. But soon things changed and they were transported to God knows where, and when they awoke, a Superd was standing before them. Of course, Hilda had taught Eris to fear the Superds and that she would be getting eaten by the demon that stood before them. She thought that she should have let Rudeus do what he wanted to that night and that they could have had serious sex later when they turned 15. She thought that she should have just endured it and let him have his way because now it's too late to do anything at all. Or so she thought. As Eris cried and cowered on the ground, the person that came to her rescue wasn't her grandfather or Ghislaine, but rather it was Rudeus. Somehow he'd worked things out with the Superd, despite the anxiety he was likely feeling. Even though she was older than him, he calmed Eris down and soothed her. It must have taken a lot of courage for him to do that, and so she fell in love with him all over again. After that, as Rudeus dealt with the demon folk and his face went pale, he continued. Rudeus didn't eat too much and he hid the fact that he wasn't feeling physically well. It seemed like he was suffering by himself because he didn't want to worry Eris, and so she decided to restrain herself too. She'd stop picking on fights and suppress the urge to yell and punch people and let Rudeus deal with things instead. She tried to act the same as she always did, but there were times where she just couldn't hold it in, when the anxiety came boiling up from deep within and wouldn't stop. That's when Rudeus would stay by her side. He didn't get angry, he didn't give any cutting remarks, he just stroked her head, wrapped his arms around her shoulders, and comforted her. During those times, he'd never cross any boundaries or anything. Normally, he's playfully obvious about being turned on by her, but during those times, he'd never touch her more than necessary. He stopped thinking for himself and only thought for her, trying to calm down her anxieties. And so Eris wanted to grow stronger, strong enough to not be a burden to Rudeus. The only thing that she could do better than him was wield a sword, and even in that regard she couldn't compare to Ruijerd. So while she could beat Rudeus in a sword fight, if he used magic, it's game over. Despite all that, Rudeus would still let her gain experience by fighting with them, but she thought that Ruijerd and Rudeus would have an easier time killing monsters and traveling the land if she wasn't there. The thought made her want to cry. She was so worried that Rudeus would realize that she's holding them back and would hate her. She was so worried that he'd leave her behind, and so she had to get stronger. She asked Ruijerd to train her, and each time they sparred, he'd knock her down and ask, "Do you understand?" Each time she'd remember Ghislaine's words and nod. Rationality. There was rationality to the way an expert moves. When training with someone stronger than yourself, the first thing you do is observe them. Because Ruijerd was likely stronger than Ghislaine, she watched him, and she trained and trained. They'd even trained in the middle of the night when Rudeus was dead asleep, exhausted. Without making a fuss about it, Ruijerd would help her even in those times. After about a year since the start of their journey, and after Ruijerd kept knocking her down, and she kept getting stronger, Eris finally realized what Ghislaine would always say about rationality. Previously, Eris didn't see a problem with sloppy movements in battle, but now she understood. Thanks to Ruijerd, that every moment had meaning behind it. And then one day, she managed to get a hit on Ruijerd. Although it seemed like that he was distracted, she didn't care. She finally did something. Now she won't be a hindrance anymore. She could walk beside Rudeus. And then he got himself a demon eye and beat her with ease, without magic. She was in shock. It was cheating, she thought. In a single leap, he had overtaken her on a road that she walked for years. She went and cried in secret, and early in the next morning she sobbed as she swung her sword. Ruijerd had told her not to worry about it, and that Rudeus was just compatible with the eye that he had received, and told her that if she trained, she'd get stronger and that she shouldn't give up. But what talent? All Ghislaine and Ruijerd did was lie to her. At the time, Rudeus looked so grand to her on this pedestal as he shone so large and bright that she couldn't even look at him directly. She wanted to catch up to him, but she had given up. But things changed when they crossed the Millis continent. She met guys and learned that there were combat techniques besides sword fighting and magic. The voice magic. She wanted to learn, but she was rejected. She couldn't understand why and couldn't accept it. And then what happened in Militian? She wanted to prove to her that she could do things on her own, and so she wanted to slay the most simple of creatures, goblins. That's when Eris caught a glimpse of her own true talent, and as she fought the assassins, she completely overwhelmed them. At some point, she had started to grow, but when she went back to the inn, she found Rudeus sad. She found out what happened between Rudeus and her father, but despite the fact that Rudeus didn't cry, she knew how depressed he was. And she remembered that he's 2 years younger than she was, but despite his age, he'd become a tutor for someone as selfish as her. He had to celebrate his 10th birthday away from his family and was forced to travel the demon continent while dealing with a burden like her, and on top of all of that, his father even pushed him away. There was no way that she could forgive that. She swore that one day she would cut down Paul Greyrat, and she knew of his strength, that he was advanced tier in the Sword God style, Water God style, and North God style. He was still Rudeus' father, but she could still win. Ghislaine taught her swordplay and Ruijerd taught her combat. There was no way she would lose to Paul. But then Ruijerd stopped her and said that it's a fight between father and son. Because of Ruijerd's past with his son, she listened to him. Eventually, the two had made up, but again, she couldn't accept it. She didn't understand why Rudeus forgave his father. She could never forgive someone like that. Rudeus didn't talk much about it, and Ruijerd didn't tell her anything either. They were both adults, after all. From there, they made it to the central continent, and that's when Rudeus started eating more, likely because he had regained his spirit. As usual, he's incredible. In a single day, he was able to befriend the third prince and save his family. As for Eris, all she could do was go on a rampage with Ruijerd. They did help Rudeus as a result, and even credits the victory to Ruijerd and Eris, but judging by what happened, Rudeus could have done it all on his own. Rudeus was so great. Too great. And he only got even greater on the day that he fought the dragon god Orsted. During the confrontation, both Ruijerd and Eris were petrified with fear, but Rudeus wasn't. On top of all that, he was able to land an attack on Orsted, an opponent that not even Ruijerd could touch. Eris's eyes couldn't follow the magic that Rudeus unleashed back then. When Rudeus got serious in battle, he was amazing. I mean, he managed to fight back against the world's strongest man, the dragon god Orsted. But just as soon as she thought that, Rudeus was dying. Until then, she thought that death couldn't affect them. Rudeus was strong, and as long as he was protecting her, she couldn't die. On top of all of that, they had Ruijerd with them, so they were completely safe. That's what Eris thought. She was mistaken. If it weren't for the fact that Nanahoshi spoke up, or if Orsted couldn't use healing magic, Rudeus would have been dead. She was so scared, and that incident had renewed her fears of being a burden. Now Rudeus was becoming godlike to her. Even though he had just nearly been killed, it didn't seem to faze him. Just 3 days after their encounter with Orsted, he was already planning a future encounter with him and practicing new magic to combat him. Eris couldn't comprehend that. She was scared, and so she stayed beside Rudeus. It felt as though if she didn't stick with him, he'd disappear and leave her behind. And then they parted ways with Ruijerd, but in the end, he taught her something. He said that beating the dragon god was impossible. But he had reminded Eris of the technique that he had used. It burned into her mind, the way that he deflected her attack. There was a method behind it. It's not like he was some supernatural monster. He was a master, but was still using techniques known to man. But then they finally made it home and discovered that there was nothing left. No home, no mother, father, or even grandfather. All of them were dead. She was heartbroken. Ghislaine and Alphonse were there, but they felt distant and formal and felt like they were different people. All she had left was Rudeus, and she wanted to become a family with him. She was impatient. He was supposed to be her tutor for 5 years, and that date had passed long ago. He'd finished his duty to escort her home, and he still had family out there somewhere. Surely he'd immediately be off and leave her behind. She just knew it. And so she used her body to keep him there. Rudeus hesitated at first, and Eris worried that he wouldn't accept her. Rudeus had always been interested in her underwear, but never peeked on her while she was bathing. And on the ship to Millis, when he could have touched her, stripped her, he didn't. Maybe he wasn't interested in her at all. All the time she practiced the sword, she lost the femininity other girls had. She wondered that despite how perverted Rudeus was, he just didn't want to have sex with someone like her. But that wasn't the case. Rudeus was turned on by her, and seeing him like that turned her on too. And so they connected their bodies. Eris had never done it before, so it was painful at first, but it eventually began to feel good. In comparison, Rudeus seemed to be enjoying it from the beginning, but partway through, he grew weak and feeble. And it's then that she realized it again that Rudeus was smaller than she was. I mean, he was a pretty good size down there, but he was shorter than her and thinner than her. He was so young, but he'd always protect her. He'd spent their entire voyage healing her seasickness, and when they exited the ship, he was extremely exhausted. Maybe if he didn't use up all that energy on healing Eris, maybe Rudeus wouldn't have been bested by guys that night. Compared to him, what was she? Sure, she'd gotten powerful, better at swordplay, but she had gotten so caught up in her image of Rudeus' magnificence that she ignored how little he really was. In the end, she used her anxiety about losing her family as an excuse to force herself on him and treated him poorly in pursuit of her own desire. She'll say it again, Eris loved Rudeus, but she wasn't fit to be with him because she'd only be a burden to him. They had become a family, but they couldn't become more than that. They couldn't become husband and wife. It was like he said, they were better off as brother and sister anyway. They weren't well balanced, and even if they were together, Eris thinks that she'd just hold him back, and so for now, it'd be better if they spent some time apart. The thought occurred to her naturally. As long as she's with him, she'd take advantage of his kindness. The sweet sensations of the night they'd spent together still lingered in her body so much that she ached for it. It was a characteristic of the Grey Rat family, but Rudeus might not be as interested in those things as she is. He was trying his best to keep up with her, but at this rate, the fierceness of her desires might confuse him. She couldn't do that to him. Eris had no intentions of doing what Alphonse said, marrying another man, and it was too late for him to tell her to live like the daughter of a noble family, being told to make sacrifices for citizens that she didn't even care about. Her grandfather, mother, and father were all gone. The Fidoa region was gone. So what was the point? Eris would throw away the Boreas name, but she was still the granddaughter of Soros and the daughter of her parents, and so she'd live on with an iron will. Eris will get stronger. She'll part ways with Rudeus and continue training. She wouldn't stop until she had the right to stand side by side with him. She didn't have to beat him, but she wanted to be a woman who was befitting of his stature. One who wouldn't leave people whispering behind her back if she got close to him. She didn't have Rudeus' intellect, and so she'd seek power. Ghislaine, Ruijerd, and Guy said that she had talent with the sword, and so she trusted them. She'll follow Ghislaine's recommendation and head to the Sword Sanctum. From there, she'd become a powerful swordswoman. Eris a swordswoman and Rudeus a magician. Normally it would be the other way around, but both of them were fine with that. The two of them would grow, get stronger, and meet each other again. Then they'd take their next step in family and become husband and wife. She'd have kids and live happily ever after. But the question is, how to say goodbye. Rudeus was an excellent speaker, and so no matter what she'd say, he could stop her, and he might even try to come with her because he was worried about her being alone. So should she leave a note? But Eris knows herself and thinks that she'd probably leave some kind of trace behind if she did, something that he could use to track her down. Rudeus needed to move forward, and Eris didn't want to hold him back. At times like these, it's best to act like the swordsman in the stories and leave quietly. But Rudeus was going on endlessly about communication. She didn't want him to hate her, so Eris thought to write something short. Surely then Rudeus would understand. And then Rudeus woke up. He said hello to his fellow normie non-virgins and made fun of all the virgins by describing how awesome sex felt, and an L to them because he couldn't relate anymore. He went to grab his clothes but noticed that he couldn't find his underwear. Eris probably took them, and so he pocketed hers. And he then found Eris's hair and a note that said, "The two of us aren't well balanced right now. I'm setting off." It took him a few seconds to process it before he ran out the door and found the things in Eris's room were missing. He found Alphonse, who told him that she and Ghislaine left for a journey and was told to keep the destination a secret. Rudeus questions why, like he didn't get it. Why did she break up with him? Why did she abandon him? And why did she leave him behind? What about family? And so that is the end. There's still one more episode, two I guess, technically if we're counting the OVA, but the end of this one. And yeah, my throat hurts after reading all of that. Yeah, this was a longer recording session, and I think, I know it's very difficult to, like, I get why the anime and manga cut the whole Eris point of view thing, but at the same time, I feel like the manga could have done it, right? Just do flashback scenes with the little dialogue boxes there, it would have worked, but I think that was needed for Eris's character. Because I don't know about, do anime onlys, did you guys not see this coming? Do you feel like that it was out of character for Eris to do this? Because when you actually see what she's gone through in the manga, and like, even before this, in the light novel, we see that she has all this anxiety building up and whatever. And it's not like even this, like, backstory that we just got of her was like out of the blue. We've seen this before. We've seen hints of this, and now we finally get the full picture from her point of view. But we don't really get any of that in the anime. All of her outbursts and all of her depression and stuff is all just played off like a joke, kind of. Or it's just glossed over, which it never is in the light novel. I feel like if you're an Eris fan and you've only seen the anime, I don't think that you can be a real Eris fan, right? Because it just cuts half of her character out. She is not just this upbeat, happy fucking brat girl, I guess. I don't know. She's depressed and she's sad because she knows her family is dead, and she has anxiety about not knowing where she is and what anybody else is speaking, and it's awful. And then all of the whole power balance thing, right? Oh God, there's so much that was cut, and it's all built up to this, and I think it works so good. Like, I do think that Roxy's best girl, look at her up there. But at the same time, Eris in the anime, I gotta give it to her, right? Eris from episode, I guess, whatever episode she was introduced in, like episode 4 or 5, all the way to here, absolute best girl. I feel like this is the best version of Eris, in my opinion. This is my personal favorite version of Eris. When she returns eventually one day, yeah, she's good. I don't dislike her. We'll get to that when we get to it eventually. But then when Roxy returns, that's where I like her, right? Season 1 Roxy, not that amazing, but everything after, super great. And then there's Sylphie, who we don't really know what's going on with her, unless you read the manga, then you do. And I've deliberately skipped all of those scenes, because I'm not spoiling that. But we will find out, I assume, like, in a couple weeks. I'm pre-recording a lot of these episodes, so I don't know when this is coming out, but this should be coming out right before season 2 comes out. So we'll be seeing certain people very soon. So if you enjoyed this episode review, give it a like and subscribe for more Mushoku Tensei content. And I will see you in the next video. Goodbye.